Let us talk now about mergers and acquisitions, okay? And I want to start from what is probably the most important concept that we're going to talk about, which is the concept of synergy. The key idea is that a merger is only going to add value if the two companies are worth more together than they are apart, and the new thing that the merger creates is what we're going to call synergy, okay? So the idea, I like to think of this idea as 2 plus 2 equal 5, right? 2 plus 2 equal 5, meaning that when you put company 1 and company 2 together, if both are worth 2, somehow when you add them, you create 5, okay? The synergy in this example is equal to 1, right? The 1 is the new thing that you create when you put the two companies together. And going back to what we learned in Module 3, the synergy is going to be the NPV of the merger, okay? Remember that the NPV is the value that is created by a new investment. When a company makes a new investment, right, the net present value is going to increase or decrease, right? Sometimes the NPV could be negative. The net present value is going to change shareholder value, right? So if synergy is positive, then the merger is going to add to shareholder value, okay? We are going to focus mostly on mergers between two companies. We're also going to talk about leverage buyouts, but we can use the same logic to talk about other deals that we're not going to have time to discuss much in this course, okay? The first one is an asset sale. In some cases, a company may decide to buy just a part of the other company. So for example, in 2012, Microsoft bought patents from American Online, right? So rather than buying American Online as a whole, Microsoft decided to buy some patents that American Online had produced in the past. The idea is that this transaction only makes sense if the patents are worth more for Microsoft than for American Online, and mathematically you can express this idea as follows, right? Microsoft plus patents has to be bigger than American Online plus patents, okay? In that case, the transaction creates value. The other type of deal that is also very important in the real world, but we're not going to have time to discuss much in this course, is a spin-off, okay? So what is a spin-off? A spin-off is a situation when a firm separates into two different parts. Usually it's two, okay? For example, in 2011, Kraft decided to split into two separate businesses. The first one was called Mondelez, which focused on global snacks, okay? And then the new Kraft was going to focus only on North American grocery business. So they split into snacks and groceries, okay? When would such a deal make sense? When does a spin-off create shareholder value? When the new Kraft plus Mondelez is worth more than the old Kraft, right? So this, you can see this is a very simple, but at the same time very powerful idea that allows us to really dig deep and think about M&A deals, okay? So now what we need to think about is when is 2 plus 2 equal 5, right? So why would a merger create value? The first argument we can think of is economies of scale, right? When two companies merge, they become bigger, right? That's what we call scale, right? And when companies become bigger, they may be able to cut cost per unit. They may be able to produce goods at a cheaper price, right? If you produce goods at a cheaper price, your profits are going to go up, right? An economy of scale could be as simple as cutting the cost of management, such as headquarters, okay? So if you put two companies together, suddenly instead of two headquarters, you just need one, right? And that is going to reduce the overall cost of the company. Of course, the idea of economy of scale could be more powerful than just cutting the cost of having two headquarters instead of one. Okay, but this is the first reason why a merger could add value, right? The second one is industry consolidation. This is a very common reason, a very common rationale for a merger, right? This is the idea that merger between competitors in the same industry is going to increase market power, right? If two airlines merge, for example, they can coordinate routes, right? They can give more options to consumers on one hand, but on the other hand, they can cut routes that are repetitive. They can cut routes that both airlines serve, right? And that may allow airlines to charge higher prices, right? And this example is more general. Every time two competitors merge, right, they are going to gain market power. And this is why this type of merger between competitors is a merger that the regulators are always watching. Okay? When competitors merge, it's very likely that the regulators are going to have a look at this to make sure that the merger is not increasing monopoly too much, right? Regulators are concerned with consumers and other considerations, so these mergers are watched very closely. Okay? The third type of rational motive for a merger is an economy of vertical integration. Okay? So in some cases, the merger happens not between two competitors, but between two firms in different stages of production. Okay? For example, recently, PepsiCo decided to buy PepsiCo Bottling Company, which used to be a separate company that was essentially doing bottling for PepsiCo. You know, at one point, PepsiCo and PepsiCo Bottling decided that they're going to become part of the same company. Okay? Essentially, the idea that bringing a major supplier in-house in some situations, right, not in all situations, but in some situations is going to allow companies to produce at a lower cost and increase profits. Okay? And finally, this is a rationale that is particularly important for private equity deals, for leverage buyouts, which is to eliminate inefficiencies. Okay? Such as poor management. Poor management is a good example. If a company is poorly managed, right, if it has governance issues, as we discussed in Module 1, right, if the management is not acting in the interest of the shareholders, if the management is stealing resources from the company, that company is going to be a good target for an M&A deal, right? There is some value to be made just by coming in, buying the company, and reorganizing the management. Okay? So we're going to talk more about that when we discuss private equity deals. And we also want to talk about some reasons for mergers that make less sense. Okay? There are several arguments that are discussed in the press, that are discussed by some practitioners, that actually, when you really dig deep and think about them, they don't make that much sense. Okay? The first one is cash. Right? The argument goes as follows. So we know that companies hold cash. Some companies actually hold a lot of cash, as we discussed in Module 1, right? And cash earns very low returns, right? So typically cash is deposited in banks, right? Companies buy treasuries. The interest rate on these instruments is very low, right? So let's say that cash is earning 1%, right? And if a company has a lot of cash, if a company has excess cash, it seems that acquiring another company must be a better use, right? You know, your cost of capital, it seems like it's just 1%, right? So, you know, you just have to generate a return greater than 1% for this acquisition to make sense, right? The argument seems sensible, but when you really think about it, you know, it doesn't work, okay? In fact, there is a very famous academic study by a guy called Jared Harford. It's an old study, but which has been replicated and validated using more recent data, which shows that cash can create problems in the acquisition market. Okay? Cash-rich companies were more likely to acquire, you know, so having cash, you know, tempts companies, makes them more likely to go out and make acquisitions. But what Harford finds is that these acquisitions were much more likely to destroy shareholder value than acquisitions that were done by companies with less cash. Okay? He actually estimates that cash-rich acquirers destroyed 7 cents in value for each dollar of excess cash that they had. So if you had $1 of excess cash and you spend that in an acquisition, you ended up destroying 7 cents. Okay? Just by using that cash to acquire another company. Okay? Right? When you really think about this, you know, why is that a bad idea? Okay? What should matter is whether the merger generates synergies, right? Going back to where we started with, right? What matters is whether the merger is positive NPV or not, okay? And if a merger adds value, then, you know, companies should be able to finance it, right? Even if you don't have cash to pay for the merger, right? You can go to the market, you can issue a bond, you can issue stock, okay? If the merger is good enough, you're going to be able to add value, okay? The lesson here is that, you know, spending cash just because you have it is a recipe for disaster, right? I think we know that when we think about our personal lives, we know that, you know, sometimes when we have too much cash, we end up wasting it. It seems that the same thing happens with companies, okay? When they have too much cash, in some cases, they end up wasting it, and M&A is a good candidate for that. Okay? The other argument we're going to talk about is risk diversification. Okay? There are companies around the world that have businesses in many unrelated industries. Those companies are called conglomerates. Okay? For example, in the US, a very famous company is called General Electric. General Electric makes aircraft engines, as you can see there on that airplane. They also had a bank until recently. They make other products. You know, they're what we call a diversified company. Okay? So let's think about their argument. Does that make sense? So should a company buy another company in a different industry, right? Let's say, should a bank buy a company that makes aircraft engines to reduce risk, right? So shareholders care about risk. So if you buy a company in a different industry, you might reduce risk for shareholders, right? Does that argument make sense? The answer is no. Okay? And why? Because shareholders can diversify risks on their own, right? If shareholders want to have stock both in a bank and in a company that makes engines, they can go out in the market and buy the stock. They don't need the company to do it for them. Okay? So it's very unlikely that companies can create value just by diversifying a business like that. Okay? In fact, the current trend in the US and in other parts of the world as well is towards focus. Okay? Conglomerates such as General Electric are actually being broken up. Okay? This is a recent news article that talks about the fact that GE is actually retreating from finance. Okay? They are reorganizing the business and spinning off GE Capital, which is the bank, okay, and focusing more on the manufacturing operations. And that's just an example. It's a very general trend in the US that companies are actually increasing focus rather than increasing conglomeration. Okay? So perhaps companies finally realize that diversifying risks for shareholders may not make that much sense. Okay? And finally, let's talk about earnings per share. Okay? So there's going to be a question for you. Okay? So let's have a look at this example here. Suppose that you have two firms, two companies, okay, and company A is going to acquire company B, okay? So here you have the earnings, the number of shares outstanding, right? So pay attention here, okay? Earnings, so company A has earnings of 100, company B has earnings of 40, okay? And here you have the data for the merged firm, okay? So here's what the third column tells you what's going to happen after the two companies merge together, okay? So let's say this merger is stock financed. We're going to talk more about that later, but essentially what this means is that, you know, the new company is going to have a number of shares for the new company is going to be the sum of the number of shares for firm A and the number of shares for firm B. Okay? So the question I want to think about using this data is this a value-enhancing merger, right? Are there synergies here? Is this merger creating value for the shareholders of firm A? Okay? The answer is no. Okay? Look at this. This is a classic 2 plus 2 equal 4 case, right? If you look at the data, right, you can see that, you know, earnings were 100 for firm A, earnings are 40 for firm B, okay? When you put the two firms together, you know, the profits are 140, so you're just adding the profits. It's as if the firms were operating side by side. There is no gain, there is no synergy. At least it looks like there is no synergy. What does happen, and this is what might have tricked some people into thinking that this is a good merger, is that earnings per share is going up, right? So earnings go up to 140, the number of shares go up to 120 as we discussed, so earnings per share is going up, right? For the acquirer, firm A is the acquirer here, so it seems that firm A can increase EPS by 17% just by acquiring firm B. Okay? What is going on? I like to think this as an averaging effect. It's a weighted averaging effect. Okay? What's happening here is that a company with low EPS is acquiring another company with high EPS. Okay? So if a company with low EPS acquires another one with higher EPS, the EPS is going to go up because the EPS is going to become the average of the two companies. Okay? That's not very, companies should not create value just by doing a transaction like that. So this is another example of why earnings per share is the wrong metric to look at. Okay? And this actually goes back to Model 1 when we talked about EPS. Remember, there was a recent deal that we talked about where EPS was going to go down, but the deal was well received by the market. The stock price went up. Okay? In that case, as we discussed, the market seems to be able to overlook the fact that EPS is decreasing and increased the market value of the acquirer when the deal was announced. Okay? So remember that M&A is another area where we have to be very careful about earnings per share.